Asterisk, hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the late 1600s, to a place where fear was more contagious than smallpox, and where having an opinion could get you hanged before breakfast. So, fluff your pillow, dim the lights, and let's float back to Salem Village, Massachusetts, a tiny Puritan settlement where everyone's business was everyone's business. And God was watching very closely, or so they thought. Now, if you've ever heard of the Salem Witch Trials, you might imagine fire, brimstone, and sinister women cackling over cauldrons. The truth is less cinematic and far more tedious, which is exactly why it's perfect for bedtime. Let's drift in. The setting, a world that was basically allergic to funnits. The winter of 1691. Salem Village is cold, muddy, and perpetually arguing with itself. Half the townsfolk are fighting with the other half about who the real minister should be. The Puritans, bless them, were not exactly known for their chill. Entertainment options were limited. No theaters, no dancing, certainly no Christmas celebrations, because joy, apparently, was suspicious. And into this environment came Reverend Samuel Parris, a man so perpetually aggrieved that he could start a feud in an empty room. He was a former merchant who had failed at business, naturally, and had decided to try religion instead. The people of Salem quickly regretted it. Parris was obsessed with the devil, which was not unusual for the time, but he took it to new, exhausting heights. His sermons had all the warmth of a tax audit, and about as much optimism. He also had a slave, Tituba, who'd been brought from Barbados, and she would soon become the unfortunate spark of the entire witch hysteria. The bored, overstimulated teenagers, the real story begins. As most disasters do, with a group of bored teenagers. In the parsonage of Reverend Parris lived his daughter, Betty, age 9, and his niece, Abigail Williams, age 11. They were joined by a handful of other village girls, all of them young, restless, and living in a world where the most exciting weekly event was a sermon about eternal damnation. So they started doing what bored kids have done for centuries, making up weird games. In this case, they'd crack eggs into glasses of water to divine their future husbands. The 17th century equivalent of astrology, TIKTOK. Unfortunately, when their parents found out, they didn't see harmless fun. They saw Satan. And soon after, the girls began exhibiting strange behaviors. They screamed during prayers. They barked like dogs. They threw themselves into fits. They complained of invisible pinches. Modern historians suggest it might have been psychosomatic, or perhaps ergot poisoning, a fungus on rye bread that can cause hallucinations. But at the time, it was obviously witchcraft, because, of course it was. The first accusations, the terrified villagers demanded answers. Reverend Parris, naturally, made it about himself. He brought in doctors, one of whom, after failing to find a medical cause, declared, "The evil hand is upon them," which is 17th century doctors speak for. I have no idea. So let's blame demons. Pressed to name who was tormenting them, the girls accused 3 women. Tituba, the enslaved woman in the Parris household. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who muttered under her breath a lot. Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had scandalously married her servant and skipped church. If you're sensing a pattern here, women who were poor, foreign, or just inconvenient, you're correct. They were rounded up and examined by the local magistrates. And when I say examined, I mean they were shouted at until they said something incriminating. Sarah Good insisted she was innocent. Sarah Osborne was too sick to defend herself, but Tituba, under pressure, and likely after being beaten, confessed. Her testimony was everything the villagers secretly wanted to hear. She claimed she'd met the devil himself, that he came to her as a tall man dressed in black. She said there was a book with 9 names written inside it, and that she'd seen witches flying through the night. It was part folklore, part survival instinct, and it worked. For now, the girl screamed and convulsed dramatically as she spoke, and the villagers took it as proof. After all, it couldn't possibly be acting, not from children, and with that, the witch hunt officially began, the contagion of accusation once Salem got started. It couldn't stop. By spring 1692, dozens of people were accused. The afflicted girls, now local celebrities, pointed fingers almost daily. It spread to neighboring towns. Even respected church members weren't safe. People accused their neighbors, their midwives, even their in-laws, which, to be fair, may have just been convenient timing. Reverend Paris doubled down, preaching weekly about invisible devils walking among them. The villagers lapped it up. There's nothing quite like a shared moral panic to bring a community together briefly before tearing it apart. Newly accused women were brought to the meeting, where they were examined by local officials like Judge Hatton, a man so self-assured that he once interrupted a confession to suggest the witch try harder. People claimed they could see spectral shapes attacking them, ghostly images of the accused pinching or choking them, and these spectral evidences were accepted in court. Imagine being tried for murder because someone dreamed you did it. That was the legal standard. The court of Oya and Termina. By May 1692, the jails were overflowing. The governor, William Phips, decided to create a special court, the court of Oya and Termina, meaning to hear and determine, which sounds more dignified than it was. It was led by Chief Justice William Stoughton, a man with the personality of a granite slab and roughly the same capacity for empathy. Trials began in June. The first to be executed was Bridget Bishop, a 60-year-old tavern owner known for wearing brightly colored clothes. In Puritan New England, this was basically the same as dancing naked in church. She was found guilty of witchcraft after several afflicted girls screamed in unison whenever she looked at them. Solid evidence. She was hanged on June 10th, marking the start of a grim procession. Over the following months, 19 people were executed by hanging. One man, Giles Corey, refused to plead either guilty or innocent. The court, in response, crushed him to death with heavy stones, a method called pressing. His last recorded words were, "More weight," which is either incredibly brave or incredibly tired of everyone's nonsense. Possibly both. The turn of the tide by the autumn of 1692. The hysteria began to eat itself. Prominent citizens, including the governor's own wife, were accused. And suddenly, officials began to wonder whether perhaps, just perhaps, this had gotten a little out of hand. The respected minister, Increase Mather, yes, that was his real name, and yes, his father's name was Cotton, published a pamphlet declaring it was better for 10 witches to escape than for one innocent person to die. A refreshing stance. Though one could argue the bar was quite low. Governor Phips finally dissolved the court in October and replaced it with a new one that no longer accepted spectral evidence. Almost overnight, the accusations collapsed. The girls' fits conveniently stopped. Everyone went home pretending they hadn't participated in mass hysteria. By the spring of 1693, the remaining prisoners were pardoned. Salem returned to normal, or at least as normal as a community can be after executing its own neighbors over bad dreams. The aftermath: in total, around 200 people were accused, 19 hanged, and 1 pressed to death. Several more died in prison awaiting trial. The village itself was left traumatized. Families of the accused were shunned. The survivors petitioned for compensation, and over the decades, the story was quietly swept under the colonial rug. By the 1700s, even the Puritans admitted they might have overreacted. In 1711, the Massachusetts government formally cleared the names of many victims and paid reparations, small sums, usually not enough to replace the property that had been seized during the trials. Because yes, during the panic, neighbors had happily looted the homes of the condemned. Witch hunting had a convenient financial incentive. Reverend Paris eventually lost his position. The villagers decided perhaps they'd had enough of his sermons about Satan. He left Salem in disgrace, though he did, rather fittingly, become a minister elsewhere. Because some lessons are never learned. Tituba was sold to pay for her jail fees and vanished from record. A quiet ending for the woman who'd unwillingly started the storm. The legacy: the Salem Witch Trials have since become a kind of cultural shorthand for collective panic, proof that the community can lose its mind with alarming efficiency. Historians still debate the causes: ergot poisoning, political tension, repressed psychology, or just a village of people who desperately needed hobbies. Probably all of the above. Asterisk. What makes Salem oddly fascinating is that it wasn't unique. Witch hunts had been raging across Europe for centuries. Germany, in particular, excelled at it. Thousands of women and quite a few men were executed there, long before Salem existed. But Salem, with its tiny population and dramatic collapse, offered a miniature version of Europe's much larger madness. And because it happened in America, and because Americans are very good at writing about their own mistakes, the story became immortalized. Arthur Miller turned it into The Crucible during the McCarthy era, using it as an allegory for political persecution, which was fitting. Humans, it seems, never tire of repeating Salem in new and creative ways. Drifting out, and so, Salem village faded back into quiet obscurity. Its fields grew over. Its meeting house crumbled. The descendants of the accused and the accusers intermarried, as New England families tend to do, until everyone was related to everyone else. Today, tourists visit Salem, Massachusetts, to buy witch-themed keychains and pumpkin latte, blissfully unaware that the original hysteria started because some kids got bored in winter. It's comforting, in a strange way. The world hasn't changed that much. We still find new witches. We've just swapped the stakes for social media. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, remember, sometimes history's loudest tragedies are just ordinary people having very bad ideas, all at once. Let's drift on to the next royal fiasco in human foolishness. Asterisk. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world of fjords, long ships, and suspiciously drafty wooden halls, the Viking Age. It's a time that lives in our collective imagination as loud, bloody, and full of men with questionable hygiene shouting at each other over mead. But tonight, we're not here for the raids, or the axes, or the poor monasteries that had a really bad 9th century. No, tonight we're focusing on something quieter, softer, and far more human. Viking motherhood and education, because, surprisingly, behind every raider with an axe was usually a tired woman wondering why no one ever cleaned the longhouse. and a child trying to remember which rune meant ox. So, settle in. Let's drift gently into the everyday world of Viking families, where survival was an achievement. Education was mostly practical, and affection was expressed by not freezing to death together. A world that wasn't all whirlwind. Most people hear Viking, they picture horned helmets, which is already inaccurate. But let's not ruin too many museum gift shops at once. The truth is, most Vikings weren't full-time raiders. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, and parents. The average Viking mother was less concerned with sailing to England and more with keeping her children alive through another Scandinavian winter. The Viking world stretched across what's now Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and parts of Iceland and Greenland. The land was beautiful, yes, but in that harsh, freezing, we could all die if the harvest fails kind of way. So, from the moment a child was born, life was both precious and precarious. Infant mortality rates were high. Childbirth itself was dangerous. Mothers often died in labor, and the sagas, which loved a bit of grim understatement, sometimes described women as taken by childbed, as if it were an overly persistent suitor. And yet, Viking women were deeply respected for their role in the household. The home was their domain, not in the dismissive stay in the kitchen sense, but in the very literal she runs this entire operation sense, while the men might leave for months on raids. It was the women who managed the farms, livestock, trade, and finances. A Viking wife could own property, divorce her husband, and demand compensation if wronged. In a society that occasionally solved arguments with axes. That's impressive. The birth of a Viking when a child was born. There was no guarantee they'd be raised. The father would perform a ritual known as utsetting, literally setting out. He would lift the newborn up in his arms and decide whether to accept it into the family. If he didn't, the baby would be left outside to die. It sounds horrifying to modern ears, and it was. But in Viking society, it was seen as a grim practicality. Children born sickly, deformed, or simply at the wrong time might be exposed. Food was scarce, and survival depended on hard choices. Those accepted into the family were sprinkled with water in a naming ceremony, the Vatni Orza, a sort of proto-baptism. Long before Christianity arrived, the child was given a name, often chosen from ancestors, preserving family lines and reputations like heirlooms. Names carried meaning. A girl might be called Astrid, meaning divinely beautiful, or Gonhi. Battlemaid, a boy could be Leif, descendant, or Eric, eternal ruler. In short, Viking parents named their children as if they fully expected them to grow up and raid something. Childhood, tougher than it looked if you survived infancy. Congratulations, your reward was a lifetime of chores. Viking children worked early. By age 5 or 6, they were expected to contribute. Girls learned household tasks, spinning wool, weaving, milking animals, preparing food. Boys helped in the fields or with fishing. The idea of a childhood as a carefree, playful stage of life didn't really exist. Childhood was training for adulthood. Still, there were moments of fun. Toys have been found in Viking settlements. Small wooden horses, bone figurines, even carved ships. Some children played with knucklebones, a sort of early dice game. There's also evidence that they had dolls, not the soft, cuddly kind, but carved from wood, sometimes with painted faces. They probably weren't great comfort objects, but they did the job. Education came mostly from imitation. You learned by watching your parents and doing things badly until you got better. Formal schooling didn't exist, though the wealthy and the noble occasionally had tutors, often priests after Christianity arrived. But for most Viking children, literacy was not a priority. You didn't need to write to farm. You needed to know how to read the weather, the soil, and your neighbor's moods. Learning the runes, that said, the Vikings weren't illiterate savages, as they were once portrayed. They had runes, the letters of the runic alphabet, known as the Futhark. Runes were carved, not written. Each one had a name, a sound, and a symbolic meaning. They were used for memorial stones, trade markings, and the occasional dramatic curse. Learning runes was considered slightly magical. After all, you were literally cutting words into the world. A few sagas mention rune carvers as wise or mystical figures. For example, in the Edda, Odin himself learns the runes by hanging on a tree for 9 days, which is one way to say education was painful. For ordinary Vikings, though only a small minority were literate, usually men involved in trade, or women of high status managing estates. Yes, women could read runes too. Archaeologists have found runic inscriptions clearly carved by women. Sometimes love notes or personal graffiti. One message from Bergen, Norway, carved on a piece of wood, reads, "Gida says, I love you, and you must love me." Proof that Viking teenagers were just as dramatic as ours. Mothers, magic, and morality. Viking mothers weren't just caretakers, they were moral anchors. They passed on the customs, stories, and unwritten laws that kept the family together. They also taught seer, a kind of Norse magic, associated with prophecy and fate. Women who practiced it were called vavlor, seeresses, and they were both respected and feared. Imagine your mother not only teaching you manners, but occasionally predicting your death in battle. Character building, to say the least. Children were taught to be brave, loyal, and honorable. Cowardice was despised. So was laziness. There was a word for it, Nidinga, meaning someone without honor. And in Viking society, that was worse than being poor. Education, then, was moral as much as practical. You learned to spin, farm, and fight, but also to hold your tongue, repay debts, and show hospitality, because you never knew when your guests might turn out to be armed warriors or minor gods in disguise. Discipline and affection. Viking parenting mixed tenderness with strictness. Children were loved deeply, but not coddled. Sagas describe parents weeping openly when their children died. Yet those same parents might have sent the child on dangerous journeys at 13. Life was short. Competence was love. Asterisk. Punishment was firm, though not necessarily cruel. Physical discipline was normal. So was public shame. A misbehaving child might be scolded before the whole household, which, in a community of 20 people living in one smoky room, was enough to make anyone reconsider their choices. Affection was shown more through action than words. A father giving a son a sword was an emotional moment. A mother weaving fine clothes for her daughter's wedding was a declaration of love. And, on winter nights, when the winds howled through the gaps in the roof, families gathered around the fire to tell stories, the sagas and Eddas that would outlive them all. The oral classroom storytelling was the true Viking education. There were no schools, but there were firesides. Around them, elders passed down history, myth, and lore in the form of verse. The Skalds, Viking poets, could recite thousands of lines from memory. Children listened, absorbing the rhythms of their culture long before they could understand all the words. The stories taught everything that needed to be known. Bravery from Beowulf, fate from the Valsunga saga, and bad decision-making from pretty much every Norse god. Through these tales, a child learned what it meant to be human in a world ruled by harsh nature and unpredictable gods, and, perhaps most importantly, they learned that even the mighty fall sometimes because of fate, sometimes because they simply drank too much mead and made poor choices. Coming-of-age adolescence, as we think of it, wasn't really a stage. One day you were a child, and the next you were expected to act like an adult. For boys, this usually happened between 12 and 15. They might go to sea with older men, or be apprenticed to a craftsman. For girls, it meant marriage, often arranged. Sometimes shockingly young by modern standards. A girl's dowry could include land, livestock, or finely woven cloth, her contribution to the household economy. Marriage was not just romance. It was alliance and survival. Yet sagas show that affection often developed later. Many Viking couples seem to have genuinely liked each other, which, for medieval Europe, was quite the achievement by adulthood. A Viking was expected to know their role, whether warrior, farmer, or trader. Education never ended, but it changed shape, from the household to the hall, from stories to experience, a mother's legacy, and through it all. Viking mothers remained the quiet backbone of their world. They gave birth, raised children, managed homes, ran farms, and occasionally practiced magic, all while being legally recognized as capable. Individuals in a society often remembered only for its men. They taught survival, skill, and resilience, not with books, but with example. And when the sagas remembered heroes and kings, they often mentioned their mothers first, because in the Viking mind, greatness was inherited and learned from the hearth. Soft tone fades, like embers in a longhouse fire. So as we drift away from the fjords tonight, imagine those families under the northern lights, mothers weaving by lamplight, children carving runes on scraps of wood, fathers at sea wondering whether they remembered to fix the roof. Life was hard, yes, but it was lived with purpose, and perhaps, in the end, that's all any education really is. Learning how to endure, and how to keep the fire burning. Let's drift onward, to another strange corner of the medieval world, where royal bloodlines twisted themselves into genealogical knots. Asterisk, hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to 17th century Japan, a land of poets and warriors, where elegance met bloodshed, and where one very grand castle became the most expensive cautionary tale in Japanese history. So, get comfortable. Maybe pour yourself a cup of tea that you'll forget to finish, because we're going to the final days of the Toyotomi clan and the fall of Osaka Castle. In the year 1615, it's a story of pride, stubbornness, and far too many decorative moats. It's also the story of how Japan finally found peace, the quiet, suffocating kind of peace under one family's rule. And it all started with one man who simply couldn't let the past die. The ghost of a dead general. Our story begins with Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a name that once echoed through Japan like thunder. He rose from obscurity, the son of a peasant foot soldier, to become the ruler of the entire country. Hideyoshi was clever, ruthless, and ambitious in the polite way that meant he probably killed a few dozen people to prove a point. He unified Japan after more than a century of civil war. And when he died in 1598, he left behind an infant son, Hidori, who was meant to inherit it all, naturally. This was a terrible idea. Japan, at that point, had roughly as many warlords as it did rice paddies, and not one of them was keen to be ruled by a toddler. So Hideyoshi's top generals promised to govern together as a council until the boy came of age. That lasted about 3 minutes. The most powerful of them, Tokugawa Ieyasu, quickly decided that babysitting wasn't really his thing. He gathered allies, won a decisive victory at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, and became shogun, Japan's military ruler. In theory, he ruled in the name of the emperor. In practice, the emperor ruled in the name of absolutely nobody, and so the Tokugawa shogunate was born, a dynasty that would dominate Japan for the next 250 years. But there was still one small problem. Hideyoshi's son, that little boy Hideyori, was still alive. The boy in the castle Osaka Castle was the Toyotomi family's last fortress, a sprawling stone mountain rising above the city, bristling with watchtowers, golden decorations, and a truly unnecessary number of arrow slits. It was both magnificent and ridiculous, like a feudal skyscraper built by someone with too much power and not enough taste. Inside, Hideyori grew up surrounded by luxury, flattery, and the ghosts of his father's glory. He was educated, refined, and by all accounts, utterly unprepared for real life. He read poetry, practiced calligraphy, hosted tea ceremonies, all the important things you do when a ruthless military regime is politely ignoring your existence. Meanwhile, Tokugawa Ieyasu, now an old man, was busy cementing his power. He built new castles, reorganized domains, and forced rival lords to live under his watchful eye. He also retired, technically in 1605, handing the title of shogun to his son Hysteria, but keeping all the real power for himself. Because, of course, he did. For years, Ieyasu kept an uneasy peace with the Toyotomi family. He even allowed Hideyori to marry his granddaughter, Senheim, a sweet diplomatic gesture that doubled as a hostage arrangement. But as Hideyori grew older, so did suspicion. Rumors began to spread that he was raising an army, rebuilding the Toyotomi clan's alliances, and perhaps dreaming of reclaiming his father's rule. Whether that was true or not, it was enough. The Winter Campaign, 1614 by 1614. Ieyasu had decided to deal with this once and for all. He accused Hideyori of treason, the usual charge when you wanted to attack someone without looking like the aggressor, and gathered an army of over 200,000 men. It was a staggering number, about the population of an average city at the time, all marching toward one castle. Hideyori's defenders numbered roughly 90,000 samurai, ronin, and desperate loyalists from across Japan. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and, most importantly, out of options. Still, Osaka Castle was nearly impregnable. Its outer walls were 20 meters high, built from massive stone blocks so perfectly fitted that they've survived earthquakes and centuries of bad decisions. Hideyori's mother, Yodadono, effectively took command of the defense. She was strong-willed, politically sharp, and widely disliked by everyone who had to deal with her, which, in fairness, was probably a requirement for surviving in that family. The Tokugawa army surrounded the castle and began the siege of Osaka, known later as the Winter Campaign. For months, cannons roared across the frozen plains. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but neither could break the other. The Tokugawa forces even tried digging tunnels to plant explosives under the walls, which mostly succeeded in scaring everyone and destroying their own trenches. Eventually, Ieyasu realized that Osaka Castle was too well defended to take by brute force. So he turned to diplomacy, which, in the 17th century, meant lying convincingly. He offered peace. He promised the Hideyori's life would be spared, that his family could keep their lands, and that everyone could just calm down and go home. Hidari and his mother agreed, on the condition that the castle's massive outer moat would remain untouched. Ieyasu agreed. Of course, and then immediately filled it in, the moat incident asterisk. This was, by all accounts, one of the most underhanded and strangely polite betrayals in Japanese history. As part of the peace terms, Tokugawa engineers were allowed to repair sections of the moat. Instead, they drained and filled them, dismantled walls, and left Osaka Castle suddenly naked in the landscape. By the time the Toyotomi family realized what had happened, it was too late. Their fortress had gone from impenetrable stronghold to decorative hill. Still, the truce held briefly. Hidari tried to rebuild the defenses, which gave Ieyasu the perfect excuse to accuse him of violating the peace. And in early 1615, the Tokugawa army returned, this time determined to finish the job. The summer campaign 1615 if the winter campaign had been about patience. The summer campaign was pure chaos. The Toyotomi side gathered what remained of their forces, around 60,000 men, including bands of ronin, masterless samurai, who were mostly in it for revenge, money, or the chance to die dramatically. They clashed with Tokugawa troops in a series of brutal skirmishes across the Osaka plain. Fields burned, villages emptied, and somewhere in all that confusion, one of Japan's largest armies managed to get lost in its own smoke. By May, it was clear that the Toyotomi cause was doomed. The decisive battle came at Tennoji on June 4, 1615. Hideyori's forces fought fiercely, pushing the Tokugawa army to the brink. But as usual, coordination broke down, and the Toyotomi troops began retreating in disarray. Ieyasu, now 72 years old and probably tired of this nonsense, ordered the final assault on Osaka Castle. The walls were breached. The city burned. The defenders fought to the last, as flames engulfed the great keep. Inside, Hidori and his mother, Yodadono, realized the end had come. They retreated to an inner chamber, prayed briefly, and took their own lives. The castle exploded shortly afterward, possibly from a gunpowder store, igniting. Possibly because someone decided it was symbolic. The Toyotomi line was finished. The shogunate's peace, Tokugawa Ieyasu, entered the ruined castle days later. He reportedly gazed at the smoke rising from the ashes and said something like, "The country is now at peace," which was true in the same way a cemetery is peaceful. The fall of Osaka Castle marked the absolute end of the warring samurai age. There would be no more great civil wars in Japan for over 2 centuries. The Tokugawa regime enforced stability with bureaucracy, surveillance, and an astonishing number of rules about where one could or couldn't live. Hideyori's surviving supporters were hunted down. His son was executed. His wife Senheim, remember? The shogun's granddaughter was returned to her family and later remarried, because politics never sleeps. And Osaka Castle, it was rebuilt by the Tokugawa, naturally, but in their own style, grander, safer, and containing fewer people who might betray them. The message was clear. History had been rewritten in stone, the ghosts of Osaka in later centuries. Osaka Castle became a symbol of doomed loyalty, the noble but hopeless stand against inevitable power. Poets wrote melancholy verses about its fall. Artists painted it swallowed in flame. Ghost stories told of Yodadano wandering its ruins, mourning her son. Even Iyasu's own descendants were rumored to see apparitions on quiet nights, because nothing says well-earned peace like a haunted castle. Over time, the ruins were rebuilt, destroyed, and rebuilt again. A recurring architectural therapy session for Japan's complicated history. The version standing today dates largely from the 1930s. With heavy restoration after World War II, its towering keep still dominates the skyline. Surrounded by peaceful gardens and tourists posing for selfies where samurai once bled, history, as it tends to do, moved on. But the story of Osaka Castle remains a reminder of ambition, pride, and how easily peace can mean simply that one side ran out of walls, drifting out so as you settle deeper into the quiet. Picture Osaka under moonlight, its moats reflecting the stars, its halls empty, its fires finally gone out. Somewhere inside those walls, a young man once dreamed of reclaiming his father's glory. He failed, but his story survived. And perhaps that's what history really is, the soft echo left behind when all the shouting stops. Let's drift on, then, to another tale of dynasties and fragile egos, where royal peace came at just as high a price. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to Babylon. The year is somewhere around 331 BC, though to be honest, the exact year doesn't matter much anymore because time itself seemed to bend around one man, Alexander the Great, a man who conquered more of the known world by age 30 than most people managed to conquer their laundry pile by 30-5. He swept across Asia like a force of nature, charismatic, brilliant, occasionally unhinged, leaving behind a trail of cities named after himself and, rather ironically, very few lasting friends. But tonight, we're not really talking about Alexander the Conqueror. We're talking about Alexander in Babylon, the last years of his life, because even a living god eventually runs out of miracles. So dim the lights. Let your mind wander past the noise of today and picture a sprawling palace shimmering under the Mesopotamian moon, its courtyards heavy with the scent of wine, sweat, and ambition. A place where the greatest empire the world had ever seen quietly began to rot from the inside out. The city of 1,000 lanterns when Alexander arrived in Babylon in 331 BC. It was already ancient, which he found rather impressive, since he was used to being the newest, brightest thing in every room. The city stretched along the Euphrates River, glittering with ziggurats and lush hanging gardens that may or may not have actually existed. Ancient writers couldn't quite agree which feels about right to Alexander. Babylon was paradise, warm, rich, and full of things he didn't have to burn to the ground. He declared it his capital, his new capital, because by this point he had several dots. It's a little hard to keep track of them, since he founded over 20 cities, all called Alexandria, which might have seemed clever at the time, but probably caused enormous issues for ancient postal workers. Still, Babylon was different. It was the prize, the beating heart of what had been the Persian Empire, and now Alexander's empire. He entered the city in triumph, dressed in his usual blend of Greek hero and Persian monarch, and that was already causing some tension. His Macedonian soldiers, tough mountain men with very firm opinions about what was and wasn't proper, were starting to notice that their king was picking up foreign habits. He wore silks. He started calling himself King of Kings. He demanded bowing to his men. This looked suspiciously like becoming Persian, the very people they'd spent a decade defeating to Alexander. Though it was all part of the plan. He wasn't just conquering Asia, he wanted to merge it. One people, one empire, under one extremely shiny haircut. It was visionary. And also doomed. The God King and his hangovers, Alexander, had always believed he was special. Not in the ordinary. My mom says I'm gifted kind of way. But in the descended from Zeus and destined for immortality sense. His mother, Olympias, was a master manipulator who had told him from childhood that he was literally divine. It's the kind of parenting that produces either a philosopher or a megalomaniac with an army. Alexander leaned toward the latter by the time he reached Babylon. He was worshipped as a god in several parts of his empire, a title he didn't exactly discourage. He'd developed a fondness for elaborate rituals, endless banquets, and heavy drinking, which, in fairness, was the ancient Macedonian version of team bonding. His generals and companions followed suit. Nights in Babylon often ended with half the court passed out in fountains while poets recited verses about destiny. It's said that at one particularly lively banquet, Alexander challenged a friend to a drinking contest. The friend won technically by consuming nearly 14 liters of wine. He died the next morning. Alexander called it tragic, but probably also quietly appreciated that no one outdrank him again. The empire of paper and dust *. Managing an empire that stretched from Greece to India required a kind of administrative genius, or at least someone willing to pretend they had one. Alexander delegated, but not very consistently. He left satraps, governors, in charge of conquered regions, often people he barely knew, and then wondered why corruption immediately followed. Letters arrived daily, complaining about rebellious provinces, missing tribute or local revolts. He'd sigh, send another army, and then return to planning new cities in deserts no one wanted to live in. Some of his old Macedonian officers began muttering that he should stop conquering and start ruling. Alexander found that boring. He preferred vision to paperwork, and, when possible, both accompanied by flute music and a gold cup of wine. But somewhere under the opulence, the cracks were spreading. The shadows of the companions of the inner circle. His companions were less a team and more a collection of ambitious men who tolerated each other only because he was alive. They'd marched together for over a decade, fought through deserts, scaled impossible mountains, and looted half of Asia. They were rich, exhausted, and increasingly paranoid. Alexander himself wasn't helping. He'd begun executing old friends on flimsy charges of treason. Parmenion, one of his father's most trusted generals, was killed on suspicion of plotting against him. His son, Philotas, was tortured and executed first, just to be sure. Then there was Cletus, the Black, another veteran companion who'd once saved Alexander's life in battle. One night, after far too much wine, Cletus criticized him, said he was becoming a tyrant. Forgetting who he was, Alexander, in a fit of drunken rage, grabbed a spear and killed him on the spot. He immediately regretted it, purportedly spent days sobbing, refusing food, and blaming his divine parentage for his temper. It was a pattern that repeated itself. Violence, remorse, more wine, repeat. By the time he reached Babylon again in 323 BC, his court felt less like a royal entourage and more like a slow-motion collapse. The return to Babylon after years of campaigning through Persia and into India. Alexander finally turned back toward home, or at least what counted as home now. He'd faced storms and deserts so harsh that entire regiments disappeared. By the time he re-entered Babylon, he'd lost tens of thousands of men. Still, he returned in triumph, greeted with processions, sacrifices, and the kind of adoration usually reserved for someone not quite human. The city itself had changed. Gardens overflowed with imported plants, exotic animals, elephants, lions, even peacocks wandered the palace grounds. It was, essentially, a live-action display of "look how far I've conquered." Alexander planned new expeditions to Arabia next, then perhaps the western seas. His generals groaned quietly and began writing their wills again, but he was unstoppable, or at least he thought he was. The death of Hephaestion, 324 BC. Tragedy struck, or as close to tragedy as Alexander was emotionally capable of acknowledging, his closest companion. Hephaestion fell ill and died in Ecbatana. The two had been inseparable since childhood, trained together, fought together, and possibly shared a deeper bond than official histories liked to admit. Alexander was devastated. His reaction was theatrical, even by his standards. He ordered an empire-wide mourning, executed the physician who failed to save her, shaved his head, stopped eating, and then commissioned a funeral so lavish that it reportedly cost more than the building of Babylon itself. He even sent to the oracle at Siwa to ask whether Hephaestion could be worshipped as a god. The oracle, perhaps wisely, said no. Alexander did it anyway. From that point on, something in him seemed to crack. He drank more, slept less. His speeches turned from visionary to erratic. He began talking openly about marching west to conquer Carthage, Rome, maybe the entire world. Everyone nodded politely and refilled his wine cup. The last banquet then came the spring of 323 BCE. Alexander had spent the evening drinking with his admiral, Nearchus, and a friend named Medius of Larissa. Nothing unusual, just another long night of talk, boasting, and the slow unraveling of an empire over cups of wine at some point. Alexander reportedly cried out, pain searing through his side, and staggered away. He thought it would pass. It didn't. For the next 11 days, he grew steadily weaker. Fevers burned. His voice faded, even as he lay on his deathbed. He continued issuing orders, planning a campaign to Arabia he would never lead. When his generals asked who should succeed him, he reportedly whispered, "To the strongest," which, in hindsight, was a terrible succession plan. He died in Babylon at 32. The death of an empire the world didn't so much mourn. Alexander has immediately fall apart without him. His generals, known as the Diadochi, or successors, began dividing the empire before the body was even cold. They married his widows, claimed his territories, and fought each other for decades. Babylon itself became one of many battlefields, its palace halls echoing with civil war. The dream of a united empire, Greece and Asia, joined as one, dissolved into fragments almost overnight. It's said that when the embalmed body of Alexander was being transported back to Macedon, one of his generals stole it mid-journey and rerouted it to Egypt. Because even in death, Alexander couldn't stop causing logistical nightmares. The quiet after-and, so the man who called himself a god ended not in thunder or triumph, but in feverish silence, surrounded by frightened attendants and half-finished plans. In the centuries that followed, Babylon itself decayed, swallowed by dust and river silt. The empire he built became a memory, then a legend, then a bedtime story for dreamers who wanted to believe that ambition could defy mortality. But under it all, the pattern remained the same: men building worlds too large to hold, empires too fragile to last, and egos too big to fit inside their own crowns. Alexander might have conquered half the world, but he couldn't conquer himself. And maybe that's the soft lesson hidden in all the noise, that no matter how vast the kingdom, it all ends the same way, quietly, in the dark, under a roof that suddenly feels too heavy for one lifetime. Asterisk.